The story of Robert the Doll is one whispered in hushed tones, a tale that sends shivers down the spine of those who dare to listen. This malevolent figure resides in Key West, Florida, and has been the source of countless eerie encounters and inexplicable occurrences. The doll, dressed in a sailor suit and clutching a small stuffed lion, exudes an air of malevolence that belies its innocent appearance. In the early 1900s, Robert was gifted to a young boy named Robert Eugene Otto, affectionately known as Gene. From the moment Gene received the doll, strange things began to happen in the Otto household. Gene's parents would hear him conversing with the doll late at night, their son's voice alternating between his own and an unfamiliar tone. At first, they dismissed it as childish imagination, but soon the occurrences became too sinister to ignore. One stormy night, Gene's mother was jolted awake by her son's terrified screams. Rushing to his room, she found Gene curled up in his bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Furniture was overturned, and toys were scattered across the floor.
Robert did it,
Gene whimpered, pointing a trembling finger at the doll, which now sat innocently in a corner. The look on Robert's painted face seemed to mock her, its eyes glinting with an unnatural light. Years passed, and the Otto family's experiences with Robert only grew more disturbing. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and eerie giggles echoed through the hallways. Gene's parents began to notice a change in their son. He became increasingly withdrawn and fearful. He insisted that Robert was alive, that the doll spoke to him, and that it was responsible for the mischief. One evening, Gene's father decided he had had enough. Determined to rid their home of the malevolent presence, he locked Robert in a trunk and stored it in the attic. For a while, peace returned to the household. But soon, the unsettling events resumed. Footsteps echoed from the attic, and muffled laughter seeped through the ceiling. Gene's parents dismissed their son's pleas to check on Robert, but the atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Gene eventually moved away, leaving Robert behind. The doll remained in the attic, seemingly forgotten. Decades later, after Gene's parents had passed away, he inherited the family home. Despite the passage of time, the memories of Robert's terror remained vivid. Reluctantly, Gene returned to Key West and the house of his childhood. The moment he entered the old house, a sense of dread washed over him. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. He climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, his heart pounding. There, amidst the dust and cobwebs, sat Robert, his eyes gleaming with malevolence. Gene hesitated but decided to confront his fears. He took the doll and placed it in a glass case in the attic, hoping that this would contain its dark influence. However, the act of moving Robert seemed to awaken something within the doll. That night, as Gene tried to sleep, he heard a familiar giggle echo through the halls. The sound of tiny footsteps padded outside his bedroom door, and a cold breeze swept through the room. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the dim light, was Robert. The doll's painted face seemed to twist into a sinister grin. Gene froze, terror paralyzing him. He could hear whispers, low and menacing, filling the room. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. Gene felt an icy hand grip his wrist, and he struggled to break free.
"You can't leave me,"
a voice hissed in his ear, its tone dripping with malice. Desperate, Gene reached for the lamp on his bedside table. He managed to switch it on, flooding the room with light. Robert was gone, but the sense of dread lingered. Determined to end the nightmare, Gene decided to seek help. He contacted a local historian, who had studied the occult and was familiar with the legends surrounding Robert. The historian arrived the next day, her expression grave as she examined the doll.
"This is no ordinary haunting,"
she murmured.
"Robert is possessed by a malevolent spirit, one that has grown stronger over the years. We need to perform a ritual to banish it."
That night, they prepared for the ritual. The historian drew a circle of salt around Robert's glass case, and lit candles at each point. She chanted incantations in a language Jean did not understand, her voice steady and firm. As she spoke, the air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A chilling laugh echoed through the attic, and the glass case shattered, sending shards flying across the room. Robert stood amidst the broken glass, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The historian continued to chant, her voice rising above the chaos. Jean watched in horror as the doll began to move, its tiny limbs twitching unnaturally. The historian's chants grew louder, more insistent. The room filled with an icy wind, and the walls seemed to close in. Robert's movements became more frantic, as if struggling against an invisible force. With a final, desperate cry, the doll collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The air grew still, and the oppressive energy lifted. The historian picked up Robert, now just a doll, devoid of the malevolent presence that had haunted it for so long. She placed it back in the glass case, which had miraculously reformed, and sealed it with a binding spell. Jean thanked the historian, relief flooding over him. As she left, she warned him to keep Robert contained and never to let the doll fall into the wrong hands. Jean nodded, vowing to keep the doll secure. But even as he locked the attic door, Jean couldn't shake the feeling that Robert's story was far from over. The house was quiet, but in the silence, he thought he could still hear a faint whisper, a reminder that some terrors never truly rest.